Hey there, good people in crypto land. I'm Matt Lysing, and this is my podcast, Decent People. Welcome back to the conversation. Today, we've got a special episode where we talked on Twitter Spaces with our reporter, Keagon Voice. He is covering where Web3 and music intersect for us at Decential. And Keagon came to me in January of this year with a project where he wanted to explore copyright in a blockchain era, where if you can put a song on a blockchain like Ethereum and it's copyrighted, you can't take it down. It's there forever. That's one of the things about a blockchain. Whereas if you put something up on YouTube that's copyrighted, you could get a nasty letter from a lawyer telling you to take it down, or YouTube would take it down itself. That doesn't happen with the blockchains. There are new and interesting questions about how copyright can work in a blockchain world. And Keagon was also interested in how Bob Dylan began in the folk tradition of singing songs back in the 60s that were out there in the ether. People would sing songs that were commonly available. They would put their own spin on it, and that was just a folk tradition. But what Dylan did was he copyrighted a bunch of those songs and included them in his music library. That library sold recently for upwards of $550 million. Not very folk of Dylan to do that, and that was one thing that got Keagon interested in this idea of where's the folk in that and where's the power to the people. So we spoke about that at length, and other issues in copyright as a new technology comes along. Copyright is usually one of the first things that sort of interacts with it. So we get into that as well. With all that being said, let's get to the episode. I hope you like it. As always, thanks for being here, and thanks for the support that you're giving us. All right. Hey there, everybody. I'm Matt Lysing. I am the editor-in-chief at Decential Media, a company I co-founded with my partner, Neil Berkeley, who's also on this Spaces. We have a great one today. This is a story we've been working on at Decential. I looked it up today, Keagon, and you first pitched this idea in January. It has been 10 months, basically, of a lot of work and due diligence and all sorts of side adventures and dead ends, but you persevered, and I think it's a fantastic piece of journalism and of writing, and I think the Web3 space is better for it because it's a really in-depth and nuanced look at copyright in an era where a blockchain can make an infringement basically permanent. It's not something that you can take down off of a YouTube channel. If it's on the Ethereum blockchain, it's there for good. That's just one of the many things that we're going to get into today. But thanks for joining us at Decential. We are really interested in telling these stories that aren't being told. We love to talk about people. We love to talk about the folks who are building Web3. And we love to ask these big questions like Keagon is asking today about where do things stand with copyright, and where is the balance between an open permissionless blockchain and the need for creators and artists to still get paid for their work. So that's what we're going to jump into today. I am joined by Keagon, a Keagon Voice, who goes by Keagon. He is one of our amazing writers. He's written about music and Web3 and music in general for years. So Keagon, before we get started, why don't you just say a few things about yourself, and then we can jump into it.
Yeah, oh, sure. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for creating the space. It has, as you alluded to, has been a labor of love that has persisted now for the better part of a year, which has included, the cooperation of a lot of different people, which I really appreciate. But before we dive into that, a little bit about myself. One piece that is relevant is that I'm from a small town in Minnesota, and that is relevant because we'll talk about Bob Dylan and that kind of connection. But I've always been a music guy, studied music in school, became a music journalist, and wrote primarily about different music scenes, especially the avant-garde and experimental scenes in New York, mostly for Vice, before getting into the Web3 world. I also have a music startup called Grey Matter, and which kind of exists between Web 2 and Web 3. But yeah, getting into the Web 3 world really exposed me and helped transition my journalism from just covering music scenes to covering the music industry. and things like the major labels, and the issue of copyright, which is huge and complex. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around this really huge complexity, this really huge complex system. But that's why you let me write 9,000 words.
Yeah.
But yeah, there you go. Brings us to today.
Yeah, that's great. And then let's say at the top here, you're not only just reporting on this story, you dove in and practiced some kind of, I guess, what I'll call experiential journalism, where you wanted to take this to the next level and, I don't know, make a proof of this of some sort, where you minted an NFT that is a cover of a Bob Dylan song, which is going to go live very soon here, probably right after this Spaces. So if anyone's interested, we'll give you some more information about that. That's one of the things I loved about this project, was your ambition to not only delve into this as a writer, but to delve into it as an artist and as someone who is getting their hands dirty in the Web3 world with going through the process of minting an NFT. So Keagon, why don't you just tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll start telling the story of how this all came to be.
Yeah. So yeah, I think as probably everybody knows here on this call, there's still a lot of legal gray areas within the Web3 space, and that is true of music as well. And trying to understand what something like a music NFT is and how it should be treated as a new music format. It doesn't really fit in any of the pre-created boxes that exist in the copyright system. And so, which means, as there's this gray area, there's sort of an opportunity to create new precedents and experiment with the bounds of the system, to poke at it and provide commentary on why it doesn't necessarily work all that well. So that was part of the impetus behind wanting to record a cover of this song. I also have a personal connection with this song as well, so it was like a good excuse to get to play music and record something and experiment with the blockchain in a more personal way. And that sort of experiential aspect, I think, also, I think that also brought me a lot closer to the piece and to the topic at hand, which I think that all felt important.
Yeah. All right. So I guess maybe I'll just kick it off a little bit, and then I'll give it over to you, Keagon, to keep going. I think what I found fascinating about this is everyone knows Bob Dylan. Everyone knows what a legend he is. He won a Nobel Prize. He's often regarded as one of the greatest singer-songwriters of his generation. But he came out of the folk era where everything was free game. And what I didn't realize was how much of, I guess, his early work and his early kind of mythos that he created about himself was, it was a story. He was telling a story about who he wanted to be. And Keagon goes into this really well in the piece that we just published today on Decential.io. So please take a read of that. So what he built a lot of his catalog off of folk music that was out there, and people were just playing it, and nobody was like claiming ownership of it. But then he started copywriting a lot of these songs that had been out in the sort of public domain. And where that became problematic, I think, Keagon, you would agree with this, is when over the last few years, he has sold his catalog and his publishing rights for somewhere upwards of $500 million. And from that early beginnings of being a folk artist and doing what folks were doing on the road back then and just singing the songs that were out there, to 50 years later, selling that catalog, which included a lot of those songs that he copyrighted for $500 million, can be seen as rather unfolk. I'll just give it to you there, because I didn't know this about Dylan, and I found it really interesting, and we'll delve deeper into it. But I think was that the itch you wanted to scratch?
It's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think Bob Dylan is from a small town in Minnesota. He's from Hibbing, and I am also from a small town in Minnesota. So growing up, Bob Dylan was just a guy. He was like one of the hometown heroes. Like whenever you said you're from Minnesota, you said with pride. Like, that's where Bob Dylan is from. Of course, also Prince. But yeah, and I think Bob Dylan presented the normalcy of his upbringing, and I think that to put a chip on his shoulder that kind of followed him around first to New York and just was constantly creating stories for himself and creating a mythos. He looked up to Woody Guthrie. He was kind of Bob Dylan's hero, his icon, and he started to lean his image in in that direction. And I think the first time that I encountered this kind of artifice of Dylan was in college when I took a folk class and read this book called Positively Fourth Street, which is about Dylan and a few other people, and is named after Dylan's song, that really elucidates this artifice very well. And it was really disillusioning to me reading that. And it's not something that I really pursued after that, aside from reading the book. But Bob Dylan as an image, as an icon, always felt very different to me after that. And yeah, I think when coming into into the blockchain, into Web3, and specifically getting involved with the kernel community, which is like a peer-to-peer learning environment that is dedicated to building a better web together. And was introduced to a few people. One of them is on this call, Glenn. And we rallied around this idea of folk, what it means to be part of the folk. This idea that it's like a trans. Yeah, I guess in the case of music, it's but all other kinds of art forms as well. It's very transmissive. It is collectively created and cared for. And as we dived into this, understanding and then taking all this in and reflecting on Bob Dylan and when he was making music, that's when this sort of dichotomy kind of presented itself in my mind. Is that he built his own canon on this tradition that existed for a long time before him. And there's literally a Wikipedia page of Bob Dylan songs that he took from other people, essentially, in terms of like key melodies and harmonies, different lyrics, and there are 32 of them altogether. And I think rationally it makes sense for that attribution to be shared, but because of the system of copyright, Dylan was able to copyright them to his own name, which through that behavior, I think, and then to your point, ultimately, over the past couple of years, he sold his music for more than $500 million. And that cognitive dissonance of building on this very transmissive collective tradition, but having individual ownership of something and be able to accumulate all of this wealth, and that felt very unfair. Is that some context?
Yeah, and I think one of the more fascinating parts of your story that really resonated with me was his like Dylan's contemporaries kind of level this criticism at him, I think, most effectively. And I just wanted to read a couple quotes from it just to get it out there that we're not just saying this. This is like out there in the record, and people have taken Dylan to task for this for quite a while. But so the first one was a guy named Oscar Brand, who was a folk singer, a songwriter, and a radio host. And he was quoted in Haji's book, Positively Fourth Street, that you mentioned. And he said, speaking of Dylan, he said, he came on my radio show and said nothing but lies about his life. He was afraid he couldn't compete and afraid he wasn't good enough, so he lied. And that made him afraid he would be caught and we would judge him. Another one is from a little more famous Joni Mitchell, who was being interviewed by the LA Times in 2010. And she said, basically, she was doubting his authenticity. And she said, quote, Bob is not authentic at all. He's a plagiarist and his name and voice are fake. Everything about Bob is a deception. We are like night and day, he and I. I took that to heart. And I think people of his generation, I don't think would come at Dylan like that if he hadn't rubbed them the wrong way in many different ways, I think. That's not to say that he wasn't an amazing artist and is an amazing artist and songwriter. It's just like you said, why should somebody come from a folk background and then get that insane payday? And so that sort of, I think, sets you up for what you wanted to accomplish here. And that's another thing about the ambition that I love in this project, is that the NFT you're minting and hoping to sell is not for your own gain, but you're going to be putting that money back into projects in the on-chain music world that are trying to decentralize and are trying to get back to that kind of folk tradition where everybody can benefit from this music. It's a transition from a folk like Dylan to the folk like everybody that you make in the piece, that point you make several times. So like, maybe you could tell us a little bit more now, Keagon, about just the complexities here of the copyright law and how that's been used over the decades to keep the powers that be, the major record labels and others in the music industry, in power when all these new formats come out, like maybe it's a digital tape or an MP3 or now an NFT. Because I think that through line is really interesting. And I think what we're getting at here is maybe blockchain and Web3 is an opportunity to try to take things in a different direction for the first time in a long while.
Yeah. Again, I'll reiterate that the entire system of music copyright is incredibly complex and unnecessarily. And I am by no means an expert, and have had to kind of rack my brains and talk to a lot of people who are experts, and hear from them the same things. This is incredibly complex. Even for me, I still have to try to wrap my head around it. And yeah, I think the sort of the core reason that is because of copyright and people trying to shoehorn solutions that reference this very antiquated system rather than actually update it. So just for some context, within music, there are two distinct pieces of copyright. There is one for the composition and then one for the recording. And both pieces have two primary stakeholders. For the composition, it is the composer and the publisher. And for the recording, it's the artist and or performer, as well as the record label. And those can be further subdivided if there are multiple songwriters, publishers, artists, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens to those songs and all the financial elements that are attached to them in order to route the earnings from an artist from our years back to the artists and the stakeholders is where this incredibly complex web kind of emerges. And it's all contingent upon different layers of ownership and different kinds of music consumption, whether it's like a digital download versus listening to something on the radio versus a stream. How music is consumed is that also affects the financial gain, and like how money is routed through the system. And over the years, there have been, as you said, there have obviously been a number of new formats, and they have threatened to upend, I think, the controlling hierarchy because of concerns of duplication. Things like copyright, it's basically copyright infringement. And the digital system, obviously, it's much easier to duplicate. There was an MP3 player that came out in the late 90s that was sued by the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America. Obviously, everyone here will be familiar with the Napsters and the LimeWires of the world. At one point, the RIAA actually filed an injunction against LimeWire and sued them, and they tried to sue them for $72 trillion, which is more than the GDP of the entire planet.
So it's safe to say that scared the shit out of them.
And that's the idea.
But isn't it fascinating that they've done this a few times now, where they took that idea of Napster and streaming and just converted it a little bit and turned it into Spotify, where the labels are now in control and artists they're still getting screwed.
Yeah. There's, if you look into the history of Spotify, which came around in 2006, a few years after this was happening, I think the injunction happening against LimeWire was in 2000, one, I believe. And yeah, there are some stories, that are somewhat believable that Spotify was, like, its initial servers were partially developed by music that was pirated. And yeah, to your point, it really isn't all that different. It made something that was illegal, legal, but from the perspective of the artist, whether a song is being pirated or being streamed, doesn't really make a whole lot of difference today. I think the median artist on Spotify, or no, sorry, it's at, what is this, that 98.6% of artists on Spotify are making like $36 a quarter.
Yeah.
Which isn't sustainable, obviously. It doesn't really incentivize you to pursue a career in music.
But we've talked about this a lot in your coverage, because I think in music more than other art forms right now, where they intersect with Web3, there's a lot of resistance and there's a lot of questions. I think a lot of musicians rightly see NFTs and Web3 as scammy. And so it's not, I think if you compared it to, say, like digital art, it hasn't quite given the underlying artists like this new path in the music world. So, but how do you hope that might change? And how do you, because one of the bigger points you make in your story is that on-chain music can create communities, and it can get back to an idea of shared values rather than everything accruing to individuals. Am I summarizing that correctly, or what's your hope there in those terms?
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the things that first attracted me to Web3 was, basically the DAO, and watching friends with benefits evolve in real time, and this world in which, like, you can use a token and a shared vision to realign platform incentives around, like, the creation of whatever you want. Hopefully that those are good things, like community and other public goods. And that kind of agency at the community level, I think, is really powerful. And of course, decentralization is one of the superpowers of the blockchain, as well as, like, immutability, as well as provenance. So just from that perspective, it's pretty fitting to uphold the tradition of folk, which, when you think about it, is like a relatively decentralized medium, in a relatively decentralized tradition, in that there really isn't the same concept of IP. It is collectively created and cared for across the community, and in the process of archival and actually passing along these traditions is really important as well. So of course, the blockchain, because of its immutability and provenance, is a very good archival mechanism as well. So yeah, I think from a high level, that's the connection there.
Keagon, the question around, to me, it's always, whether you're talking about CC0 or decentralized distribution, it always comes back to artists wanting to know either how they get paid or how they benefit. And I understand the idea of community and building a brand, but the basics of, let's say, if someone wants to make music that's CC0, how can they strategize getting having a living?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it speaks to this. I think the kind of foundational question of, like, how can we take something like the blockchain without harming creators who are still relying on copyright to earn money? And I think in a lot of ways, this is all cut from the same cloth as, like, the Creative Commons sort of work. We created this kind of suite of licenses so that there would be more middle ground between the extremes of all rights reserved, which is a copyright system that, like, the creative industries are largely built to use, and then the public domain. And there are all different types of attributions and types of protections that you can use these licenses to exist in having more nuanced nuanced protection of your music, because the reason that something like all rights reserved might not be that appealing to a creator is because it also limits how people can use your art, how people can distribute it. And if it's very difficult to freely distribute your music, then you're not going to have as many people actually hear it. Creative Commons, I think, was trying to balance between creative protection, but also the ease of access to information. So I think in terms of the blockchain, I think the blockchain that can use something like C0, which is the loosest, most open form of Creative Commons license, which allows creators to waive all copyright and related rights, making it available to the public domain by connecting it to the blockchain. So there's this artist, Ty Woody, for example, who has done some work with Decential. He released Noun Sounds, which is part of the Nouns DAO, which was a music platform focused on providing free-to-use music for creators. And he released a bunch of his own music there, because conceivably the blockchain can complement the objectives of Creative Commons by providing a secure and transparent way to enforce and manage licensing agreements. For example, blockchain-based platform can track usage of Creative Commons licensed content and then automatically distribute royalties to creators, in which case the art moves with ease and then the value accrues via the art's cultural impact. And when you consider something like the internet, which is naturally mimetic and encourages free moving information, and that people are constantly using as memes and iterating and then iterating upon, it makes sense to lean into that as long as we have a mechanism to track that. That's something he's done. For instance, he told me, I'm going to talk about Super Ty Woody, that this is his quote, which is also in the article. This NFT is on the blockchain, so you can prove that you own the original. So if you encourage people to use it, hey, go remix this, use my loops, you can go sample it, then the proliferation becomes the marketing of those assets and then adds value back to the original. So I think that's a pretty strong example of how something like this can be used with the blockchain pretty effectively.
Yeah, this came up on a spaces we had last week, because I think that's really, and I'm surprised, maybe there are platforms that are doing it, but the idea of decentralized distribution, the closest there is right now, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but still YouTube, to be honest. I'm surprised that no one has built a platform that does that, but also welcomes advertisers, that welcomes subscribers, but also has.
I think, what about IPFS, the Interplanetary File System? Is that a distribution system, or is that just a decentralized database? Or is there a difference?
It's a good question. I'm definitely not the expert on IPFS and have only used it as a backend storage device. But yeah, I think there are some examples of like Web3 or blockchain-based platforms in which you can just put whatever you want on. You can distribute your art as you see fit. But obviously there are some complications with that, like you don't own the rights to it. But I think it is one of the powers of the blockchain, is that you can really put whatever you want on it. You can distribute your content there however you see fit.
It does seem like an opportunity for someone that's just massive, like a Taylor Swift or a Drake, to create an ecosystem, because anyone that entered that and put music on it would obviously have that association. Yeah, I think someone at that level could do it. Just by being a part of that community, part of that club, and contributing to it, you just, especially the first people in. I'm surprised none of them have tried to do something like that. Whether it's a DAO, or it's a platform, or something that's decentralized, allows people to put their art on and distribute and collect royalty.
Yeah, I think that some of like the music NFT platforms are doing that, but the issue is like I guess I think you're talking about the hybrid system, which allows you to balance copyright with like the decentralized nature of like using smart contracts and then like the ability to use smart contracts to distribute royalties, etc. And I think that's that has been baked in to some smart contracts to generate splits to existing rights holders. There have been like a couple examples on the platform. It's called Another Block, which has falsely advertised a Justin Bieber drop and like a Rihanna drop, and it was really one of the producers who had a small percentage of the future royalties of that actually sell those future actually fractionalize further the future royalty shares of streaming income across a group of people, which doesn't work very well because streaming royalties they're already very fractionalized across a lot of different stakeholders within the legacy industry. But I think one of the interesting examples was Grimes. She built in and then released Elf Tech. This is where AI comes into the picture as well, which was a blockchain connected platform that open sources Grimes' creative self, basically her voice. And she open sourced it to anyone that wanted to create music using her voice, but through the blockchain was able to set up a 50% split of the revenue of any successful AI generated song that used her voice. That's a really nice balance, I think. You can go use my likeness, but the blockchain is going to protect my likeness by routing a split back to me for anyone who actually uses it in a commercially successful way.
And didn't the record companies perk up at that in a way because they saw, oh, that might be good for us? Am I interpreting that correctly?
I don't know. I don't know a ton about Grimes' history. I think she owns all the rights to her music. I don't know if there are labels involved. So I think that made it very easy for her. But there have been some other people who have played around with decentralizing their likeness. Examples like Holly Herndon, who built HollyDAO, and she sees a future, and I think we're starting to experience it where it's very different to control your own likeness. People can take a picture of you and turn it into whatever they want, using AI. So in order to protect her likeness, she built a DAO around it, basically around her voice, which again helps to protect her likeness in a way that is more mimetic and works with the core mechanics of the internet.
Yeah. So can you just talk a little bit about Folk and what the goal there is, and then a little bit more on, you want to be splitting all of the proceeds of this NFT that would go to Folk and a few other decentralized on-chain music kind of startups and projects. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think Folk is a reflection of all of these things that we've been talking about. Just basically, copyright may do a good job of protecting individuals' creative contributions, but it does little to represent our reality as interdependent, interwoven communities. And that's especially true in our digital reality, which is inherently abundant and mimetic. Folk is an embrace of that connectedness. And we're a collective that is focused on tracing ancient folk relationships and methodologies in order to embed them into a new commons infrastructure and cultural flow. Trying to resurrect some of the folk methodologies, again, using these very aligned traits, of blockchain that in order to uphold that tradition. In terms of this project, folk came together through Kernel, and we've been working on it basically as long as this piece has been coming together. And that is the four core of us. Just want to give shouts to Glenn Pope, who's on this call, Kyle Smith, as well as Adam Lieber, and some others have definitely contributed to what has come together today. And we're also going to, today, we're actually publishing a manifesto and talking about how this Bob Dylan experiment is the first in what we hope is an entire series of experiments in which we support the open sharing of knowledge and creative works to resist the idea of scarcity, to try and challenge the bounds of a system that are still limiting that openness. And for all of these initiatives, all the raised funds will be split across contributing artists as well as the Folk Treasury and aligned partner organizations. And the Folk Treasury will be used to support subsequent experiments and artists and stewards who are caring for our world and for our histories. And especially in the spirit of this experiment in which I'm commenting on the cognitive dissonance of Bob Dylan. He's espousing all these folk views and has done so his entire life, continues to do so. But unfairly, also he unfairly accumulates all this wealth. Nobody needs $500 million. So the idea is in this experiment is to try to take something that he helps create through the folk tradition and use that as an experiment on the blockchain to raise funds and redistribute the wealth to other communities who are doing work that is referencing the folk tradition. So for this first experiment where we've created splits, we'll create splits for the NFT that are being routed to Keagon and all genre, Kernel's Song Camp, as well as Water and Music. So those are our first 5 partners for this one. They'll each receive 10% of all of the NFT sales, and the other 50% will go into the folk treasury to be used, for other experiments like this.
Yeah, that's really cool. And as I understand it, currently the drop is still being worked on. Do you expect that to be live soon?
Yeah, it'll be live in the next couple hours for anyone listening who's interested.
Cool. And what's the platform people should go to look for that?
We're doing it on the Optimism blockchain, but through Zora. So it'll be on Zora, and we'll also publish our manifesto through Mirror, which will also have a link to the NFTs. Okay.
And I don't think we've mentioned this, but the cover song that you did is Girl from the North Country by Dylan. Mm-hmm. Is that how people find this, or what is the title of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the title of the NFT is actually This Machine Kills Copyright. And that's also the title of the piece that I wrote for Decential, and that, as well as encapsulating all of the things that we've been talking about today, is a reference to Bob Dylan as well. As I mentioned earlier, his icon growing up, his coming of age icon was Woody Guthrie, who very famously had a sticker on his acoustic guitar that says "This machine kills fascists." So this is also a reference to that.
Yeah. Thank you, Keagon, for this. It's been fascinating. And again, congratulations on the piece. It was many months of hard work and perseverance. And I think it's a fantastic piece of research and piece of writing and piece of activism. And like I said, getting your hands dirty with the Web3 mechanics of things. So I think, I don't want to embarrass you, but I think the space is better for things like this and projects like this that you're taking on. So thank you very much. Everybody listening, please go check out the NFT on Zora, read the piece by Keagon on Decential.io, and follow us on Twitter for more of this kind of reporting and investigations into the people and the big ideas that are all making Web3 such an interesting space, both in the ups and the downs. So,
thank you, Matt.
Yeah, Keagon, thank you so much. And Neil, thank you for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We will be back next week with another Spaces. And just keep an eye on our Twitter and Decential.io for more of this kind of stuff to come.